Good evening, everyone. I am Anshula Mehta, Assistant Director at Impact and Policy Research Institute, IMPRI, New Delhi, and I welcome you all to episode 18 of our talk series, The State of Gender Equality, #Gender Gaps, organized by the Gender Impact Studies Center at IMPRI, along with GenDev Center for Research and Innovation and Delhi Post. Today, we have with us Professor Ritu Devan speaking on the pandemic, policy, and patriarchy, the process of gender de-equalization. The chair for today's session is Professor Govind Kelkar, eminent professor, chairperson of the Gender Impact Studies Center at IMPRI, and executive director of GenDev Center for Research and Innovation. Thank you, ma'am, for taking out the time to chair the event and to add your insights to the discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Ritu Devan. She is the Vice President of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, visiting professor at the Institute of Human Development, trustee of the India Forum, and president of the Indian Association for Women's Studies from 2014 to 2017. She was, till her retirement, the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics at University of Mumbai and the founder member of the first Center for Gender Economics in Asia. She has over 150 publications, including 40 books and monographs, encompassing a wide range of issues, including development economics, gender studies and gender economics, rural and urban development, infrastructure, labor markets, environmental displacement, peace studies, among others. She was a member of the Feminist Economists Group for engendering the 12th and 11th five-year plans, as well as of the subgroup on gender and macro policies appointed by the Planning Commission, Government of India. She is also consultant to UNDP, UN Women, ILO, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, World Wildlife Fund, ActionAid, and others. Her other honorary posts include National Executive Member of the Pakistan-India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy, Honorary Advisor to the Kashmir Foundation for Peace and Development Studies, and Board of Trustees of the Center for Budget Governance and Accountability. She is closely associated with training and capacity building related specially to gender budgeting and gender issues, and has conducted numerous workshops for the central government and also several state governments, including Jammu and Kashmir, Maharashtra, Goa, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and others. Her research focus, which interlinks academics, advocacy, and action, is the result of issues related to the marginalized, the last two focusing on theoretical empirical analysis of paid unpaid work and demonetization. Thank you very much, Professor Devan, for joining us today to share your insights on this intriguing theme. Without further ado, I hand over the proceedings to the chair, Professor Govind Kelkar, to make her initial remarks and then invite Professor Devan to deliver her talk.
Ma'am, your mic.
So we have very eminent scholar among us, Professor Ritu Devan, and Anshula, Dr. Anshula has done a very good job in introducing her. So I don't need to add anything, except I think that Ritu Devan has been very much associated with the economic justice movement and with the kind of women's movement. So that is also, so here we have a meeting or her ideas on really that she would discuss the policy and practice and how patriarchy has developed and created and recreated in her talk and particularly in the context of COVID. So we look forward to hearing you, Ritu, and that's just wonderful. And if I have to say something, then I'll say after your talk and after discussion address. Thank you very much. I don't want to take the time which would be more useful than when you talk. Ritu, on you or Arjun, you please conduct.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anshul, for the introduction, and of course, Govind Kelkar, and really quite delighted that you are chairing this session. It means a lot in terms of the insights which you will be bringing in. Delighted to be here, honored to be part of the IPRA presentation. And I think in the past few months, you really have done remarkable work in terms of focusing on gender gaps and gender issues through a wide range of aspects. Now, I will be talking today on, of course, I'll put on the PPT in a bit, because as usual, as an economist, there has to be data. Otherwise, it really, of course, I will not be reading out the slides, that's all there. But my focus today, and something which has really been, I've been working on for some period of time, and theoretically, of course, and in terms of policy analysis, data analysis, but also as a result of the work which I've been doing with the migrants ever since the lockdown was announced. And consistently throughout, whether it's my academic research or any other component in terms of advocacy or ground level action, that what struck me the most, in fact, is the issue that it's really not so much the pandemic, but the policy response or the lack of a policy response to the pandemic, which has created the huge issues that we are facing today, particularly where women are concerned. And that this has led to a process of a reversal of whatever few gains which we had over the past few years or the past few decades. And I will go through some of these in detail. I'm sharing my screen now. Please let me know, Arjun, if it's on. Is it on? Hello?
Not yet.
Oh gosh, this, I wish I just in a way handed it over to you. 1 second, I'm not
Yes,
able to find the share screen.
You can go to share screen again. Yes.
Yeah, I'm doing that, but
That green button.
yes, but somehow it's just not coming.
Okay.
No problem, ma'am. Ma'am, you can go to the file again.
Yeah, that's why I've kept it open, and that's what I'm doing, but somehow this is an internal problem. 1 second.
Oh, just close it and open it again then.
Now? Has it come now?
No.
These technological challenges, no, is... I'm still trying my best, but somehow...
No problem. Just email it to me.
Now?
No. Ma'am, just email it to me.
We just did it, no?
Yeah, it's coming.
It has come.
Oh,
Yes,
okay,
control
fine.
L.
Thank
Ma'am,
you.
you can go control L. Yes.
Now, I don't want to fool around with it.
No, nothing will happen.
Something happens to it.
No, nothing will happen.
Who knows? All right. Now
Okay.
I'm just using this because in any case, the font I've used is pretty big. So this is basically the fundamental which I will be talking about. I have structured this in two ways. Actually three, because first I really want to talk about the context in which the pandemic came to us. It didn't come in a vacuum. It didn't come in a societal economic vacuum. There was already certain situations which were existing, certain structures which were already there, certain processes which had started several years back. And then what comes within the pandemic and the impact of pandemic and the policy. And this, when I take gender issues, I include, of course, women, sexual minorities, who we really don't talk about, particularly in terms of transgenders and what they went through, and sex workers, who are the worst and the most affected. Another aspect which I think really has to be focused on, actually there are two, but I'm taking only one because otherwise it really becomes too long, that under the cover of COVID, or while we were all busy with COVID, there were certain other background processes which were going on. That is a camouflage in particular. And that is the introduction of the labor codes, I must say, in a very undemocratic manner. And the second one, which, like I said, one can do later at some other point of time or during the discussion, is the Farm Acts, on which we are seeing a huge impact. and that the fundamental question of the Farm Acts is really what I think the farmers have been saying very clearly, the implementation of the Swaminathan Commission report, and which is the only report which says and which recommends very strongly that women must be recognized as farmers, which they still are not. And of course, when we talk about policy, I will focus on government expenditure and of course the issue of revenue. Because in fact, when the situation demands huge increase in expenditure, there has been a very strange kind of a contraction, which now I think even the Niti Aayog has come up and said that, no, we really need to increase the capex component. So I will start basically with the pre-pandemic situation. And this, I think the PLFS data is on, and in the pre-pandemic in the last 5, 6, 7 years, 2011, 12 to 17, 18, certainly is a huge fall in GDP, a huge fall in employment of men and on women, and in particular of women in rural areas where it fell down by 10% in a period from 6 years, 11, 12 to 17, 18, urban very low. And here, and this is why when we talk about issues like social distancing, etc., I really want to say we're already socially distanced, whether it's in terms of caste or religion or gender or whichever way one may put it. And that the highest fall, in fact, in work participation rate of women has been maximum amongst the tribals, then amongst the SC, and then amongst the OBC. And that the fall in work participation rate of women has secular every single state in varying degrees experienced a decline in work participation rates, except very interestingly the state of Bengal, where it actually showed an increase of about 3%. Also, the gender wage gap data is out, and again, the gender wage gap has increased instead of decreasing. So this is what I say, that this is a situation which already existed before the pandemic came, and what really has the pandemic done in terms of the policy or the lack of a policy response. Industrial output already very low, functioning very low levels, huge increase. I think the Oxfam report and even the World Bank has pointed it out, that the income inequality and the wealth inequality increased very sharply in the last 4 or 5 years. I'm not even talking about the individual levels, but I'm just talking about in terms of proportion, which is there. The consumption data is out. That in up to 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20, that consumption and demand expenditure had actually been decreasing over a period of time. And this is primarily because in India has the lowest monthly minimum wage of barely 4,300 a month. And this is really the lowest in South Asia. And it's not even I think maybe it's just 2/3 of what countries like Pakistan and Nepal have. Nutrition, very much so, shocking NSS data that 3/4 of rural households already did not have nutrition. Increase in population, not in absolute numbers, of course it would increase, but in relative terms, the share of people below the poverty line has actually increased. And that during this process, and I don't think anything really shows the nature of the state. And when I say the nature of the state, I mean the macro patriarchal construct of the state, that even when the economy grew, though at a low level of 4%, already more than 1/5 of salary jobs had already fallen. And of course, you have all the other indicators where we've fallen in terms of equality, in terms of hunger, in terms of environment. I'm not even getting into issues like press freedom and human rights, etc. So therefore, when the pandemic comes, what does it mean and what does it really happen? First of all, I have a huge objection, and I'm sure many of us do, is the way the pandemic lockdown, or really I would call it a lockup, how unplanned it was, how sudden it was. I mean, you can't have 4 days to, light diyas and clang thalis and close down a country of India's size within 4 hours and the population of India, where 1/3 are migrants. I think this was one of the most unforgivable decisions, economic decision or political decision, whichever you may call it, taken into account. There is a lot of data which has been coming out, of course, not so much by the center, but RBI data, CAG data, and various other organizations. And I want to use some of this data to show really the kind of impact which it has. Now, it was estimated about 24% decline, but I think many economists have calculated that the GDP actually fell by 50% because there was an informal component which was not taken into account, as was also not taken into account all the various categories of informal workers in the Indian labor market, primarily, which is informal sector. Data released just last week, and this was really quite shocking to us, is that of the top listed manufacturing companies, and this is a period when one would expect that profits would fall because sales were falling, people do not have money to spend on different kinds of products apart from consumption, that profits actually increased by almost 20%. And this really, I think, and of course wages fell, and this I think is the greatest indicator of the growth paradigm. I'm not calling the development paradigm, but the growth paradigm within which the current nation is existing. Already we had a lowest monthly minimum wage, 4,300, which has fallen to about 3,000 now. A 23% fall is something which is really very huge. And at every level we will see, of course, some data is there, some data is not there, whether it's in terms of economic data or extra economic, political, caste, class, income, assets, at every level, inequalities which were already very high before the pandemic came have increased even more so. And within this, women and sexual minorities in all their avatars are the worst affected. Now, the data which I will be sharing, of course, locates in many instances a higher proportion of men would be impacted, but then you cannot see women in isolation from what is going on in the rest of society, because otherwise you're going to marginalize them yet again. So I'm trying to give comparative data as much as possible. The impact, and I'm taking these two issues separately. I'm taking the economic impact, that is the impact on women's livelihood, and then I will take the gendered impact in a very specific, or what we call women specific issues in a different manner. Now, when I started listing out the impact on women's livelihood and what are the changes which have come in terms of the pandemic or the pandemic policy, what really I would like to say, I listed out some 29, but I realized that I could not take all into account. So they're just about 15 or 16, which I will be dealing with. Of course, the fact that women historically first to fire, last to hire, that we know. A large proportion of men in the informal labor work sector, but very much more women. And here there's a long list. We are familiar, domestic workers, SSIs, vendors. What really, and that's why, you know, this policy component is something which I find it's not only problematic, it's just blind, I think, to the ground realities. You have a large number of women and men, of course, working in the handloom sector. And this is something which could have been supported so easily. But last month on National Handloom Day, the Indian National Handloom Board is disbanded. You know, to do it on the same day somehow was like salt in the wound, when you actually should be strengthening, because this is something which was very, very possible to do as part of your policy response to the pandemic. Globally, of course, we know that men have also lost jobs and women have lost jobs much, much more. And in India, it is that 40% of women who were working in regular jobs have actually lost their employment, and it's very doubtful that they're going to get it back. Overall, in terms of employment, men very high, women even higher. And amongst, I think, the worst affected because of this issue of physical distancing and wearing masks and sanitizations, etc. And also, I think a very, anti-lower class kind of a perspective that, oh, these people live in slums and they're dirty, etc., etc. And therefore, they are domestic workers not allowed into buildings. And when they were allowed after a few months, very viciously, people who'd been working, women who'd been working for decades, were not paid their wages. And it is shocking. And these are surveys which have been done across different cities, that 99, that's almost 100%, used up whatever little savings which they had. I worked with them, I interviewed some of them, and this is the second whammy, what they called, after demonetization. That time they sold everything in the first 3 or 4 weeks of demonetization, even their pressure cookers, their little nose rings which they pawned, every single item that they could pawn, that they have pawned. And this process has happened all over again, when a simple thing like a basic income transfer would have really helped these people to just survive. I'm not even talking about nutrition levels. That is another issue which I will come to. Of those who are working, more than half of the women did not get their wages. I mean, this includes even people, even journalists who have not been getting their wages for a very long period of time, not to speak about those nurses and doctors. That I think is one of the unkindest cuts which has been there where the state policy is concerned. There are two other areas where women are hugely employed, and one, of course, is the SHGs. And this is something which India has been very proud of, that we have, we have 6 million SHGs in the country, and so many women are involved, an average of 10 women in every SHG, and that's how they're managing their livelihood, etc., etc. But not a single policy response where SHGs were concerned. Totally disrupted supply chains and various other kinds of problems which they had. Another sector on which again and is hugely impacted, and on which there has been some debate but not enough research, is that of MSMEs. Now, this also, we are really a huge driver of growth historically within our country. Almost half of all manufacturing outputs comes from MSMEs. 40% of exports, which is really, really very high when you see the other one or two other neighboring countries. And of this, women form a very substantial component in terms of owners, in terms of workers, etc. And this really faced a triple whammy. There was total disruption in supply, domestic demand decline, external demand, of course, decline, and then comes your China issue, the India-China issue, which is there in Siachen and other areas, and a total cessation of any kind of exports or imports from China. And a lot of these MSMEs depend on these cheap imports which have been there historically. Even simple things like tires and rubber and small little plastic buttons and hooks, etc., which are imported historically from there. It is expected that the poverty rate, and these are figures which have just been released by World Bank and various other organizations, that before the pandemic, or till March, if one can say pre-pandemic, 13% of women and around just about a percentage less or so of men, that was the level of poverty which existed. Now, this is the poverty level which is defined by the state, etc. And I'm not getting into the debate on poverty line, because that itself is a huge issue, that in fact the poverty line is just so low that no human can survive on what has been defined. That it is already low, and both for men and for women, it is expected, for men a little more than for women, it is expected to increase that much more by 2021. That is the current FI. Extreme poverty, which is defined as $1.9 per day, was 73 million in 2019. This year, 87 million, and by 2021 financial year, it's expected to increase to 110. That is a 40 million increase in terms of just women, and a large number of them female-headed households. There is, of course, across the board, we know, fall in wages, fall in incomes, and there are a large number of organizations, NGOs, who seem to have stepped in to do a lot of the policy support work which the state actually should have done. And that women have been working for 8 to 9 hours a day on as low as 15 rupees. And these are studies, small studies, which have come from UP, Orissa, Bihar, and 1 or 2 other states. But these are the main 3 states where these studies have been done. And in Bombay or Mumbai, sex workers, because of the issue of physical distancing, etc., are now charging 10 rupees. The extent of destitution among sex workers and transgenders is something which is, it's just unbelievable to see the extent to which they have been impacted. Of course, we've had the process of reverse migration, people going back, and women, when they go back, they face increasing competition from the men who've come back, and of course, a further incentive, if we may call it that, to a decline in wages overall, and very much so where gender-based wages are concerned. Now, rural, of course, we know that Narega, which was supposed to be scrapped, on which there was a lot of opposition, has been a savior in some kinds of ways. And the demand is increased so much, but not even 1/4 of the demand has been met by across the board. I'm talking of all the states as on an average. And the worst lot, I think, on which the whole pyramid of exploitation has been built is migrant workers, migrant women in particular, and of course, your sexual minorities and sex workers. And when we talk even of, in digitalization and the policy of digitalization, and that, yes, money will be given, how will it be given? But still, and this is RBI data, is that all 176 million women still do not have their Jan Dhan accounts, and nor are they operated. That is a totally different figure in which one can go on from there. They are what I call, well, extra economic. We can't say it's non-economic in that sense of the term, that already in India, 2019, I think that is when the data has come out, that 40% of girls drop out between the ages, which is your secondary and lower college levels, and that only 11% have access to mobiles. So when we talk about online education, one of the first policy components would have been to provide basic mobiles to all, forget about computers. And we already know Aishwarya's case and several other cases where you have had girls committing suicide because they could not continue with their education. Another, I don't know what to call it, a policy response or a policy withdrawal, but from April, 60,000, I think that is 60,000 students in India who were getting scholarships. And this is only at a school level. I'm not talking about a university level, that this has not been distributed. What has been done to the money is a different issue. I'll come into that later. There is a massive decrease in nutrition level. And this is already when the NFHS data tells us that almost half the women are underweight and more than half are anemic. Surveys have been done, whether it's by Hunger Watch or various other NGOs, the Right to Food, and several other organizations who've been trying to collect data on this. And cereal consumption, now this is where your 5 kilos free to those who have ration cards policy, which came in. And what we kept arguing, those who are working amongst the migrants and amongst the poor at this point of time, that please don't look at migrant cards. Just please give every household that comes 5 kilos or 7 kilos of cereal and of pulses. But this was not done. The only instance, and I really admire this, is Pune municipality, Pune in Maharashtra, where they said, forget Aadhaar, forget ration card, whoever wants and whoever comes, we will be giving the 7 kilos. And that really helped to some level. More surveys have come in, midday meals, of course, except for 1 or 2 states which are still running it. But that even the dry rations which are distributed wherever they are distributed, more than half the children did not get it. ICDS closed, childcare services closed, immunization, the data came in just yesterday that already within these 8 months, that the percentage of immunization of children has fallen by 25%. And in certain areas, in Bombay municipality, we have made some calculations that the infant mortality rate has increased, the child mortality rate has increased, and because of interruption in antenatal services, your morbidity and maternal mortality rate again has gone up. One area on which very little work has been done, but there are several doctors who have brought this up. I belong to several doctors groups because we've been trying to raise, support for them, whether it's in terms of masks or PPEs, etc. That unsafe abortion, which already is up to an average 60 million abortions are carried out in India every year. And now with this facility not available, because the focus is primarily on the COVID corona virus issue, that unsafe abortion practices have really gone up. And it is estimated, again, this is just last week that the information came out, that unplanned pregnancies and what's going to happen within a few months is that 26 million couples have been already affected by unplanned pregnancy. So one can expect a huge rise in the percentage of unsafe abortions which are going to take place now in this current post-pandemic period. There is also, and Maharashtra, again, because I've been working on issues in Maharashtra, but this has been reported everywhere, very much in Tamil Nadu, very much in Rajasthan, in Gujarat, UP, Bihar, I think everywhere except the Northeast, that this has been reported. And that is a fall in the age of marriage, even to the extent of girls of 9 and 10 getting married. Now, this is not something new in that sense of the term, because the work which some of us have been doing on environment and development projects and displacements, that the threat of displacement or any kind of an economic shock leads to various results. And one of the major results is a fall in the age at marriage. And to have this situation and then to have a national debate that the age at marriage must be raised, I think is a little too cynical. I really don't know what word to use. There is a term now which has emerged, and that is called the shadow pandemic. There has been a lot of debate on this. There's a lot of work which is going on this, and that's a huge increase in domestic violence which has taken place. Of course, one is that you're at home with the person who abuses you and beats you. You can't get out. So, plus, please remember that 80% of India lives in one-room shanties if they have a home, or in huts. So that closeness and that claustrophobia of living in a room and living with your abuser is something which is very difficult to deal with. But if maybe the affordable housing issue had been taken seriously in the past, this would not have come out so strongly. There is, of course, we see across the board, this is not new, but it has certainly increased, and that is gender-based violence. The issue of violence against women, the acid throwing, the rapes, the abductions, the gouging out of eyes. This is something which has there in the past few years, because violence at a macro level it's just been normalized, and now it has been internalized. So therefore, if there is silence at the top on the kind of violence against women which is taking place, then of course it's like the citizens have the right to do exactly what they want where women are concerned. Now, after the Hathras case, local organizations did a survey, what we call a budget analysis of the Nirbhaya funds, and they found that in UP, which has the maximum number of violence and rapes against women, particularly, of course, Dalit women, and this is something which none of us have understood, that Dalits are untouchables except when the women are to be raped. That 76% of the Nirbhaya funds still today are unspent. Also, what is not acceptable, certainly not acceptable, is the kind of, there was this order which was given by the various courts that the prisons are overcrowded and that those who are under trials, etc., on good behavior should be released. Now, I think none of the students or the professors have been released. In fact, more and more are crowding the jails. But who have been released in many instances are convicted rapists. This is something which it's unbelievable how openly this has happened. And at least in 9 cases of which I know, that the rapists have come back, the released rapists have come back and have killed the girls and killed the girls' families. Of course, there's destitution, there's homelessness, a large number of people in Mumbai, very much I can say, and I'm sure also it's everywhere else. And that is people who could not afford paying their rent, that they were really thrown out to the streets. Migrants I was working with, they wanted to go back to their homes, but some of them did not go back. And I kept trying to understand. I said, why? We are organizing your buses and trains for you. Why aren't you going back? And they said, because of jab hum वापस आएंगे, we will not have the room for rent. We will not get it back. So then where are we going to stay? So this issue of homelessness and destitution, which has not been taken, I think it's just not being talked about at all. And of course, the worst policy, I really don't know how to talk about this. It's the issue of unpaid work. Already we know, I mean, I've spoken about what percentage of the girls who have come back, who withdraw from school, about 40% of the girls who withdraw from the ages of 15 to 18, and half of them withdraw to do housework or what we call unpaid work. Now, I'm not getting to theorization on paid and unpaid work, but certainly the use value, exchange value component of it. And what has happened is a strengthening of unpaid labor, of that, I see the Indian economy and all economies, of course, as made up of 2 sub-economies. So you have the paid work component, doesn't matter how low the wages are, and you have a huge base of unpaid labor of women and also of men. It's not as if it's only women. Of course, the majority is of women. And this fundamental, the support structure is actually increased and intensified. And within this is something which was done with no ordinance, no announcement. The cylinder, the gas subsidies for the cylinder, about 170 or 180 rupees per cylinder, that was withdrawn in April itself without any announcement. And for a cylinder which from 400 rupees is now in Bombay, it is about 700 rupees. Not to get that 150 for the poorer population is something which is very traumatic. So in fact, you have women now scrounging for dried mangroves and various other kinds of palm trees, etc., to try and chalao their jula. And of course, Ujjwala, which was touted as one of the most revolutionary reduction, and it did have an impact over, maybe not ideal, but certainly it reduced the unpaid work of women, that was stopped on the 30th of September, in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of the lockdown. This I really think is it's unforgivable where this policy aspect was concerned. Within this, you have another attack on the rights of women. Of course, there are many other attacks on different kinds of components which are contained in what I call what we know as the labor codes, which we are familiar. I'm not going to them in detail, just to tell you where the gender component and the attack, particularly on women's labor, all labor rights, and particularly on women's labor rights, are so very important. So you have your code on wages, which replaces all these acts. We are familiar with this. And here I'd like to mention, people don't see the Bonus Act as extremely important in terms of the analysis which has been done. But please remember, under the Bonus Act, the computation was, or the method for computing the proportion of bonus was built into the law. Now it has been taken out of the law, and it is just going to be defined by an executive or by an ordinance by some bureaucrat or some minister who has no context of the reality of what is happening in amongst the poor, and particularly even the formal labor market in India. There is the second code, which is on occupational safety, health, etc., which replaces 13 acts. Okay, again, I'm not going to all these acts in detail, but there are two which I would like to mention very much. One, of course, is the Plantation Labor Act, which has been removed. And under this new Code 2, which is now, as we know, law, this has been passed without any kind of discussion in Parliament, is that one of the aspects of what the Plantation Labor Act used to say is that subsidized housing, subsidized health, a bit of insurance, a bit of educational support, that all this used to be given by the management or by the employer of the plantation workers. This has been removed, and the onus now, the financial burden, has been transferred from the management, from the employer to the panchayat. Now, for what this is subsidizing the profit component, no? Not the wage component. It's a total reversal. And also what it does, that in these pandemic times, when talukas, villages and districts and even wards, when they need more funding because of the huge issue of GST and not getting enough developmental funding, that even the resources which they have are now going to be constrained. The second act, and I'm just mentioning it here, is the Interstate Migrant Workmen. Now, this is not to say that all these acts were implemented fabulously and, not romanticizing the past at all. But in fact, the pandemic and the impact of the policy and what the migrants went through actually gave rise to a lot of issues which could have been integrated into the migrant laws and improve the condition of migrants, but actually the reverse has been done. And of course, the issue of BD workers, they have got their, they've had such a huge struggle from the 60s. All these acts have come through struggles. It's not something which is very small. The dock workers, your Mathari workers, Bakwa, and see, all these acts, all of them are linked to movements and linked to struggles of the workers. The third, of course, is the Social Security, which came in just about a week ago, and it replaces 15 acts which are there. Again, I'm not mentioning in detail, but please note the Maternity Benefit Act of 61 has and this is something which our founding fathers, just after independence, and the women who were in Parliament really fought for this. And what is most I don't think it's even legal. Constitutionally it is legal, that the cess funds and all the welfare funds, and this is not the state money, this is the workers' money. This is a portion of what the registered workers put into the welfare fund. The employer puts in an equal amount, and this is used for the welfare of workers. And a large amount of this money was used for education of daughters. Of course, in one or two cases, which we raised issues on, even for marriages, because that really institutionalizes dowry, etc. For education, for health, for maternity, for family planning, etc. All this has been withdrawn, and all of them have been taken away from this. The fourth act, which I think affects everybody, and I'm just going to mention it, is of course these three acts. The industrial relation, which is still, the draft rules are out, even the Code 3, the draft rules are out, and I hope we can get our act together and try and implement and make some changes in that, at least to a very serious level. Now, taking overall, if we see where these labor codes and the attack on labor rights, particularly on women's rights, are concerned, that the beginning of the code says, and the preamble, if you can call it that the labor codes codification is for ease of doing business. Is this what labor rights are for? I mean, these are labor codes. These are not business codes. So therefore, the intention is very, very clear in the preamble itself. Also, what the labor code has done, particularly where women are concerned, that it redefines and it devisibilizes the work, the workers, and the workplace, and de-recognizes all kind of home-based workers, whether it's domestic workers, apprentice, BD workers, zari workers, embroidery, garment, etc., etc. And therefore, none of these categories can, even the Sumangli scheme, the apprentices, that none of these categories can now come under whatever so-called benefits in quotes which are there. And this is the rise in the working days is something which is part of the labor code, and also what 12 states have put forward and already started implementing, again for attracting investment in pandemic times, that the work hour, which internationally is being reduced to 6 hours a day, has gone up from 8 legally. This is legal, to 10 to 12, and in certain states to 16 under what is called emergency conditions as defined by the employer. For women, the delinking of sexual harassment. So now your safe condition does not guarantee you protection from sexual harassment. Of course, the minimum wage calculation, which is a very typically patriarchal calculation. So a male is equal to 1 full consumption unit. A woman is equal to 0.8 consumption unit. And 2 children, 0.6, 0.6. So you have your, in any case, your happy family of 2 adults and 2 children. And the total consumption unit, which is calculated, is 3 instead of 4. Now, I'm not seeing children as children, but I'm seeing children as the future workforce. So you're talking about the quality in terms of nutrition and physical and mental capacity of the future of India in terms of the majority of the population. Of course, aged are not included. There is typical patriarchal definitions. Transgenders do not exist. Single person households, many of us are single person, not included. Workers' representations, women workers' representations, which were 50% earlier, reduced to 1/3. And in some instances, there are no workers represented, whether of men or of women. And of course, the extension, what we used to call ESMA, Essential Services Maintenance Act, has now been extended to every sector and I'm not talking about privatization and PSUs and what is happening once these are privatized. We've seen what's happened to the ports, what's the railways, the largest employer in India, and what is going on where these are concerned. Now, how much time do I have left? Hello?
You can go on for
Okay,
around 5-10 minutes. Yes.
Yeah, 10 minutes. Maybe if I go a bit over 10 minutes, please forgive me.
No problem.
Because, you know, the argument which is put forward is that there is no money. The government really has no money. The central tax revenue is falling. It shows a fall of which is there, and that is Q on Q, which I've taken year on year comparisons. This is of course RBI and CAG data, which has just come out in the macro reports and various other kinds of sources of data, that in fact, when central government spending should increase during pandemic time, it has actually fallen. And the largest fall has been in subsidies, and the cruelest fall of all has been in food subsidy. This is I really don't know what term to use for this. Maybe later on I'll end with a quote of what one of the workers said. Food subsidy, when nutrition levels are so dramatically low. You know, you go to a worker today, and an informal worker, a migrant worker who's come back and living on the streets, and you ask him, kitna kamai hua aaj ka? Now it's a daily basis, it's not a monthly basis calculation with the workers have learned to make. And they count in the number of chapatis. They will not say 50 rupiah ke 400 rupiah. They'll say 10 roti kamaya. You know, this this is the reality. And in this, to say that food subsidy fallen by 1/3 is, I think, a total criminal act which exists. The Q1, Q2 data is also out, and April to September, and the central government expenditure has fallen by 1.53 trillion. This, when money is available, it's not only the tax revenue, there are many other sources on which money, and what I call wasteful expenditure, and some I will mention, some we are already very familiar with. But some of the states have actually increased their expenditure, maybe to a small amount of 0.20 trillion, but still. And this, please remember the issue of GST. It is a constitutional issue. It is there in the Constitution of India that the sharing or the devolution of funds between the CG and the SG is something which is there, and we know of the huge struggle which is going on where states are concerned. And so therefore, to raise little bit of resources, the only two recourse which the states have to increase their revenue, one is alcohol tax, VAT, which they are allowed, which of course impacts women much, much more in terms of, the expenses of the house, of the limited expenses now which are spent on alcohol, and the kind of violence that it generally leads to. And of course, petrol, which then increases your CPI and your wholesale price index, and of course, your consumer price index. The year ago period data has also just come out just a few days ago, and the actual expenditure which is there was equal period till October, that's April to October last year, and what it is this year has actually fallen by 5%. And this is again something which is inexplicable, or it is explainable, like I said, in the words of a migrant worker. The capital expenditure has fallen by 12%, and within this comes this extremely uneconomic, inexplicable, I don't know, again, inefficient, that actually the RBI spends money. What did it spend money on? And this is when rupee is the only South Asian currency which is falling, that it actually bought dollars when the dollar was the highest at 75 rupees. Now, to spend this kind of a money when we already have overused, your exports are low, your revenue data, all that is very clear in terms of how much of excess there is in India. And I'm not even talking about the FDI and this entire context of Atmanirbhar. To have a term like Atmanirbhar and yet calling for more foreign investment is an utter contradiction in terms. It's a total contradiction in economic sense, and also, of course, in terms of policy and impact. Now, this is something which I really wanted to, and I will probably end in 5 minutes where this is concerned. This is the CAG data which has just come out again about last week that it came out. And these are ministries, some of them, I've taken only selected ones, where the spending has actually fallen. Again, this is year on year, compare Q1, Q2 of 19 and of 20. Your statistics calculate funding has dropped by a whopping 72%. And this is when there is no data on migrants. It is claimed that there is no data on migrants, and yet no effort is made to spend money to collect any kind of information. Law and justice reduced by 62% when cases of violence are so huge. MSMEs, MSMEs and textiles, when so many people are employed, we've seen the figures in MSMEs. Power and shipping, yes, one can understand the reduction. Skilling and entrepreneurship, this and tribals who are the worst affected. And this is something where a lot of programs could have been carried out and money could have been spent. And I think the biggest shocker for us was that 73% of the Nirbhaya funds in the center went to the Ministry of Home Affairs, and on no conditions of what it is to be spent on. It was just given over, or it was appropriated, and it does not remain with the Ministry of Women and Child anymore. On the other hand, the highest spending, 90% more, was Ministry of Civil Aviation. And this is, of course, getting your stranded NRIs back, and rural development increase, agriculture, etc., etc. What I find very interesting is that finance increased only by 11, health and family welfare, which in fact should have increased by maybe 500%, has actually gone up only by 14%. Okay, because your lockdown period or your lockup period, whatever you may call it, is the time to develop your infrastructure, your health infrastructure, more than anything else. And what I find very intriguing is that parliamentary affairs spending 4% more. Parliament has not met, the course has been truncated, and yet what are you spending on is something which is very strange to me. Now, how does one conclude? I mean, of course, these are, I mean, a nursery child will tell you that the driver of growth is demand and it is not supply. Also, the most cynical, I think, statement which came was a request during the first lockdown by the governments to please pay your workers. I mean, employers, please pay your employees and your workers, etc. And yet, COVID warriors, nurses, doctors have been agitating to be paid their salaries. They have not been paid their salaries. You know, first, this term warrior is such a masculine military kind of a term which is used. Of course, there have been others, the issue of credit, when actually for SHGs in particular and MSMEs, there should have been a moratorium on debts. So your entire policy of corporatization of your monetary policy rather than a people-oriented monetary policy. The policy design also is something which is very problematic. There was 1,500 rupees which was given for 3 months to widows and to some disabled categories. Now, okay, 1,500 is pathetic. All right, that is another issue. The amount is another issue. But what was the policy design? That this 1,500 was to be given over 3 months, over 3 months, 500 rupees each. Now, these women and these physically disabled people, remember, there's no transport, there are no buses, there are no trains. She has to depend on private transport to go either to the taluka headquarter or to the district headquarter to collect that 500. So what we've calculated is that 200 rupees of that 500 is spent just on accessing that amount of money. So basically what she gets is that much less. Now, if the policy designer said, okay, 1,500, 8 times jaake le lo, don't make 3 trips in 3 years, apart from your exposure to the virus, etc., etc. There is, of course, the issue of mobility, female headaches, and nothing, absolutely nothing has been done for remand homes, for orphanages, for juvenile centers, for what you call, mental homes, etc. Absolutely nothing. Not a single policy statement which has been made. And I would just like to end here that, you know, it's we do gender budgeting, etc., etc. But the fundamental concept, one concept which we have been opposing for a very long period of time, I personally have been fighting with the Planning Commission when it existed, is please don't have a Ministry of Women and Child. It should be Ministry of Women separate, and then you can have Ministry of Child and Youth or whatever separate. This again reinforces the patriarchal thing of that children are the responsibility of women alone. And of course, we know that about, I think the normal calculation average over all these years is that 93% of what is allocated to the Ministry of Women and Child is spent on children and only the rest on women. The issue of GST, I'm not getting into that, but what it is doing by not giving the GST, not only is it flouting the constitution, but it has reduced development funding for the future. So the impact which you have on patriarchy and on development and various other indicators is a long-term impact. It's not going to get over in 2 months or 6 months or within 1 year. And you know, rhetoric is one issue, your commitment to gender issues, etc., is one issue. But the only translation which makes any kind of a sense is the allocation. That how are you articulating your commitment in money terms? And I was horrified. This is, of course, -1 FI. That is last year's budget. This year's budget is just totally, reworked into what is called relief package, etc., etc. That 410 crores were given, and this is national data, for working women's hostels, plus Mahila Shakti Kendra, plus creche scheme, plus rescue trafficked women, plus widows. This is almost half of what was given to the cow welfare mission. All right, and the calculation which is made, of course, is very much there, that what women get, these categories of women get 34 crores a month for all women in India, while the cows in India get about 187 crores. That is per month. That is the expenditure. And to end, really, how does one end except to say that the issue really, therefore, becomes one of recognizing the state as, is it an enabler of equality? Is it so is it really an enabler, or is it a de-equalizer? And that is what I see as the fundamental, that what the policy has done, the pandemic, of course, but what more than that, what the policy has done is to actually take people, and within them women, back for a very long period of time. And I will end here. There's a lot more, but I'm sorry if I have gone over. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Ritu Diwan, for covering so many of issues. And I know the time is less for covering upon each of them. So without having any further ado, let me start the panel discussion. Govind ma'am.
I thought I was coming after the discussant, but I would, is the discussant, we should give the first chance to discuss.
Yes, Anshula, why not? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so our first discussant is Ms. Pankhadi Dutt. She is a public policy consultant, economics and finance at Niti Aayog.
Professor Diwan, thank you for that presentation. It's actually, the situation is way more grim than what I was aware of, and thank you for sharing some useful numbers that I'll be actually looking at for my work as well. As far as the pro-cyclicality of the expenditures are concerned, I was also appalled to see, why what is happening. And the lack of optimal revenue reallocation is also very surprising. And, I keep telling my team at work is that when you have bad news, it's usually, there's cyclicality. So it's usually followed by good news. So, and the whole world is in this together. So fiscal transparency is very, very important at this point of time. And we have to share how we are spending the money and, what is the impact. And while the central government at least has some numbers, state governments are actually very, very, there is a huge lack of transparency when it comes to how states are spending their money, or what their impact is going to be. So that is one side that the more granular the data, the better we'll understand what the impact has been at state level also. So that is something I am rooting for as well. When it comes to the lockdown measures, I mean, even now as we are opening up gradually, what we realize is that schools and creches have not opened up, but we're all expected to show up at work. So again, without any heed being paid to the situation at home as to who's going to educate the kids, who's going to sit with them in front of the computer, because kids will not study, just open the laptop and attend classes. And this I'm talking about older kids who are still going to school, have schools. There are mothers who have younger kids, who don't go to school, and the daycares and creches are not open. So the only option they have left is to quit work. What happened during lockdown was, you said that there were 2 points. Women had to, women in formal jobs had to leave their work, and domestic work was not being called at home. I think the second point fed into the first point is that the share of majority of the household work and child care and elderly care fell on the woman's shoulders. And that is why a lot of women had to quit. They could not spend adequate amount of time on their work, and which led to them quitting or being fired. And again, the general outlook is also that, the trend also shows that women are usually the ones who are fired first, as you pointed out. The second economic impact that you briefly touched upon was, salaries, wages are usually lower for for women than men. And if you look at the PLFS survey, the data is, it's the urban male. This is for the entrepreneurs class. Urban male earns more than a rural male, followed by urban female, and the lowest is obviously rural women. And again, among entrepreneurs, rural women, most of them are actually, they are not entrepreneurs. They're somebody who's working as domestic worker, or like, unpaid work, etc. So the other impact of the lockdown was, the public transport closed down throughout the country. And because women earn less, they do not usually have two-wheelers. They don't know how to drive. They're not car owners. So, and at the same time, when you shut down public transport, they are not usually left with a lot of ways to commute as well. So again, women who, as the, uh, I can give an example of Delhi Metro being shut down, even though, people were asking staff to show up to work. So this again takes a huge economic impact on the wages of women and how it is used. So a lot of women get reimbursed only for metro. And they had to commute by autos, rickshaws instead, which increased their expenditure. So these are inequalities that were actually, exacerbated during the pandemic, and obviously through subsequent phases of the reopening that has happened. And um, as you pointed out, these inequalities already existed and have been exacerbated. So once again, thank you so much for bringing out these numbers. I am actually, I'll be using a lot of your information to inform my work as well. And that's it from my side.
Thank you, Pankaj. So Arjun, we have the second panelist, right?
Yes, ma'am. So our next discussant is Dr. P. Rajeshwari. She is Assistant Professor, Political Science at the School of Humanities and Social Science, GD Goenka University.
Thank you, Professor Divan. I think I'm really in awe with so much of data and the kind of work that you've done and the way you've analyzed it. It's really amazing. And I must compliment you for that. So thank you so much for bringing in so much of clarity related to the kind of inequalities that exist. Having said that, I would like to say that now it is a well-established fact that the pandemic itself is anything but a great equalizer. And I think your data is completely like, talking in that sense. It also it's clear now that the pandemic has further led to women typically take on the greater share of the unpaid housework, and hampering, obviously it's going to hamper their return, and progress later to the paid employment. And to understand the impact of the pandemic on women and also to frame policies, I think would require to move beyond a growth-oriented approach related to evaluations of the economy also. And I'm also wondering, after listening to you, going back to, I mean, I don't come from an economics background really, and come from a political science background, and really taking it from there essentially, and trying to understand that your work really resonates with what we have read with Martha Nussbaum's work also, and particularly in the context of South Asia. And I think the GDP approach is essentially speaking in terms of averages, which is quite deceiving, and it's not really telling the real story. They tend to speak in averages, but do not tell us like what the real story is. So I'm wondering that would it be correct then to say that you require a lens that becomes important and talks about each person to be valuable? And essentially, I think from what you were talking about in your data also, I was thinking about the whole idea of the dignity per se of every individual, that I think is completely lacking in policy itself. And that's what I think your data, and even I would say Nussbaum's work, talks about essentially. So I was wondering if that kind of approach is what is really required, and it's not absolutely there. So policies and multiple ways of policy making is approached, if it's approached through such a lens, then, you know, naturally this parity is not going to happen. So when we speak of, for instance, a universal kind of approach, or like, you know, a basic income approach also, what do we keep as the threshold? I just thought if you could reflect that a little bit. Should capabilities be one of the threshold, or what is it that we take as a threshold? And I would also like to flag another issue over here. I did several months of fieldwork in Jharkhand on a capacity development program, and also fieldwork related to sex workers based in Delhi and different parts of India. And your work also, you've talked about sex workers. And from the work that when I spoke to these women, I realized that they're very well aware about the different kinds of bodily exploitation that also happens, and these several inequalities that persistently they face because of the patriarchal structure. But there are also everyday resistances that they are engaged in multiple ways. And I think to understand their struggles, like, you know, and complexities within these patriarchal power structures, I think it will be also important to unearth some of these, like, you know, not just patterns of dominance, but also patterns of resistances that are often hidden and never spoken about really. And I think, do you think it would require a critical kind of lens to be able to, and state and policymakers need to have that kind of critical lens to be able to unearth these? And I would also like to understand that, you know, how these struggles and resistances can become a point of understanding these power structures, and whether it is possible to weave that in the policy structure also. Is there any possibility of that? And the third thing that I really wanted to flag was that when we speak about these, this lens that we are speaking in that context, like, you know, something that really tells maybe a feminist lens also, since you've been involved so much with the women's movement, and you were saying that, you know, patriarchal ways of policy making itself is a problem. So I'm wondering that even if we take, as suppose if we take feminist lens also as being a lens, then there are also disagreements and different, and particularly when you're talking about sex workers, because, you know, within the feminist movement also there's disagreements related to that as well. So do you think it's important therefore to have an intersectional approach, which is flexible to different sets of realities and contexts, and which work towards inclusiveness rather than reinforcing those very policies and practices that they really set out to challenge? That's like, you know, one of the things that I thought. And also we need to carve out maybe a lens which is also perhaps, I don't know whether you can call it a South Asian way of looking at things, because we know that, and your work also and your data also specifically talks about this, that, you know, how things are not similar for the entire structure. I mean, you know, universal ideas perhaps wouldn't work in that sense. So these are the three issues that I really wanted to flag, and thank you so much. It has indeed been a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you, Dr. Diwan.
Anyone else would like to come, or Ritu, you would like to address these questions, or let me also say something and then how we should go about? Anshula, is there any other?
Yes, ma'am, we have a wild card entry.
Asha, okay.
That is Professor Devanathan. Because sir has been listening, if he can also come and say something, ma'am, then you can.
Would you like to comment, all of it? You have been listening, you said that. Why don't you come?
Yes. Anshula, why don't you just introduce sir?
Yes, we have.
Or he can introduce himself.
That is also fine.
Anshula may not be ready, so just say, you can tell me.
Anshula was ready.
Okay, I'll just take Govind's place over here. I am Dev Nathan. I mean, well, an economist among other things. I was also fortunate to had a very good group of students when I was teaching at Bombay University. One of them was Ritu. So I was happy to listen into this lecture by Ritu. And just one point I would make, that one side of the story was brought out by Ritu, the manner in which the whole way in which the entire burden of this crisis has been pushed on to labor and particularly to women in different age groups and in different locations. The other side of it is that there's a very clear policy of building an economy based on very high levels of monopoly or oligopoly, whichever way you put it. So we have on the one side the removal of all protections for labor, of all the end of Ujjwala and all of these little schemes which were of some benefit to women. And on the other side, we have a policy of promoting the largest, they're not just now mega corporation, they're becoming hyper corporation, particularly the way in which Reliance, Reliance expects to combine its monopoly or its very strong position in the telecom market with a strong position in the retail market and become a monopolist in more than one market and utilize big data to be able to really create a large, very large enterprise. Now, Tatas may also come along in this manner. They have been somewhat backward in this. They've not utilized the strength of TCS and their entire own IT companies. But these are now also likely to be allowed to get permits to start commercial banks. Now, this is the most dangerous move because you will have big capital and big banks getting together. Not only will the bank capital loans or the deposits that each of us make be utilized for the benefit of big capital, but they'll give them a very strong position in the economy as a whole. No country has done this, has allowed big companies, corporations to start their own banks. And as we are moving in this direction, so the other side of what Ritu said is really the manner in which the oligarchies or the monopolies are being allowed to take over and to take over the Indian economy. I'll just make this one comment here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nathan. We would like to go to our chair now, Professor Govind Kelkar. Ma'am, if you would like to come in with your comments.
Sure. I don't have any disagreement, or I have 100% agreement how the process of de-equalization have increased over the years, and particularly in this period of crisis or virus kind of attack. So women were always seen as the last kind of categories. And so when the crisis came, the money was diverted to various other things, and they were getting it least in terms of either and a lot of schemes were introduced, as Arjun would say, but these schemes really did not make any impact. And that's why I said that they were like palliatives, that in order to say, oh, we are doing so much, and the reporting at the international level that they were doing it, because there is also kind of international level that commitment is made in SDGs, that India is very much a party and it does present, and the whole Ujjwala scheme. India has acquired such good name. I was in a meeting in Oslo and I was surprised to see not a single Indian was there except me, and I was also representing another organization. That how India was praised for this kind of clean cooking energy and doing something for the climate. So then I realized that really what happened, and then I decided to study also in terms of how these schemes are to be interpreted. Ritu has done very good, Professor Ritu Diwan has done very good gender budget analysis of the whole budget earlier, where it is going and how it is going. And only one kind of thing that there is a little difference I find between the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Ministry of Child Development, in terms of either perspective or in terms of, it's more kind of bizarre, of course, if these funds go to Ministry of Home Affairs, the Nirbhaya funds, because I have seen this kind of Ministry of Women and Child Development One thing is that it is only the whole question of spending all the money for children and not at all to women's empowerment, because they are only basically mothers. They are the breeders for the society or India, or to control the population both ways, and nothing else about them. They are not seen as the individuals in their, or the human beings in their own right. I also kind of think that it is, you had a very comprehensive picture, database picture, Professor Diwan, on kind of dismantling of development in India. Whatever the gains were made, or at least we have a hazy picture of some gains, and they have come in a very kind of sharp analysis that how these gains women have lost, and men have also lost, but women in particularly are hit harder, as the data show and as we repeatedly read. But there are some other things that is also we need to understand, that the women have not been taking lying down of any age, young and not so young women. Okay, that is what kind of thing that is also important. Any kind of crisis also does create some kind of जैसे बिजली चमकती है ना, तो उसमें भी कुछ होता है. So any kind of thing that you, any kind of crisis, I saw this in Asian crisis, but that time I was in Thailand, and I saw it now. So the activist of Pinjara Todu, or the kind of feminist or women's movement recognition of the sex workers, okay, itself is kind of thing. These are some challenges that are not challenges, these are some advances. Earlier they were challenges. Women's signature campaign, almost every day we have to sign, give our signature for one or another, and these signature movements are very powerful. Vikalp, then reportedly the rural commitment. So there is a resilience and resistance that also is increasing against the state, which was not in pre-pandemic situation so much. There were people, but as the activist and as the kind of state oppression increased, and the more bizarre kind of situation came, the resistance also increased, and that gives us the hope. So people's resistance movement, farmers resistance movement, we should not really ignore these kind of the gains made during pandemic. And I think this kind of resilience and resistance we need to recognize when we are presenting this picture of the adverse impact created by the by pandemic, handling the pandemic situation. Also, I wanted to say that Dalit women and rapes. In my village, there was a saying, and I remembered now, that having a sex with a Dalit woman does not affect the caste purity. The Brahmins and Thakurs repeatedly said that. Not marriage, okay, but extra kind of sex, raping them, that did not affect their caste purity. And now we see this more kind of thing in a very bizarre kind of fashion, in a very open fashion, which is being repeated. Not surprised at all about withdrawal of the gas subsidies, because they'll say that we have achieved the quota, so why we should do that. But we need to really look at this, and we need to point out this, that this achievement, what are the dark corners in this achievement. So I see myself in terms of kind of hope in this, in these resistance and resilience building. And they need also kind of COVID, what is coming out of the COVID, when the things become so bad, so bizarre, so kind of, it is not that people are miserable and they are not able to, how much food was distributed by the communities to the migrants and to others. And so the community action also is important to look at this. Otherwise, I mean, what Professor Ritu Diwan pointed out by the state, what the state did, and I totally agree with that. But I think there is another side of it, which is, I'm not saying that this is the kind of, there should be this kind of crisis and then people become aware. But what is important is that this crisis also has led to realize, to talk about these things, which we talked earlier, but it was a tiny group of the feminists. It was not so widespread, where the young and old and middle-aged, everybody came out and they are talking about. Gender question itself is spread in terms of looking at the And the third thing we need to pay attention. I was recently in my village, and what I was came to for some family kind of festivities, and what I was surprised to see, every woman was complaining about the increased care work, and they wanted really to children go away. So these were the children who were whether they were in the school or they lost jobs, they were all there, and these mothers have become so much overburdened that this kind of motherhood, which is kind of very much valorized, that oh, they will do everything, sacrifice, they say, when they can have a kind of breather and they did not have a breather from this enormous work. And I did not see any kind of violence, but definitely there were reports, because and the study that has been conducted by IMPRI of this telephonic survey, that there are ridiculous, and I also asked Pradhan people, that there are ridiculous grounds on which the violence is happening, domestic violence. Children are crying, and woman is blamed that she cannot take care of the children. There is too much salt in or the food is not tasty, or food is not hot. That is this thing. And she is not taking care of in-laws and other dependents. So women are beating left and right within home, within domestic sphere. And of course, the garment study, and which I have been having the advisory role, and also public, in workplace and public spaces also, we need to see how much violence has increased. And this increase in violence is also that young men feeling threatened that these women are going to take jobs. So let them be there. So domestication of women is also going to increase. So on the one hand, we have the resilience. On the other hand, that there would be there is of course the official fall in the women's employment. So that you pointed out, and then this data is very, very important. But surprisingly, state is sitting in a very kind of, what to say, I'm lacking the either word in Hindi or English, in a very slumber kind of thing, that they are doing the good work or they are not doing good work at all. Whether it is farmers or it is women, they are at a loss how to address the issue. So dig the roads in order not to come them to Delhi, so that the problem is solved. This is how the approach is, which is ridiculous kind of thing. A state which has been talking about emerging economies in Asia, and this is the situation. So thank you so much, Professor Ritu Diwan. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Professor Kelkar, for highlighting these issues and for bringing such important points to the discussion. Professor Ritu Diwan, would you like to come in now and respond to these comments, and then we can have some more questions and comments after that?
Ma'am, you can choose to touch upon any of the issues, yes.
Yeah, I know, because the issues are so vast, so you'll have to give me 2 extra lectures over the next year to be able to complete
We can plan
answer.
that, yes.
No. So I just, there are many issues which have been raised, so I'm just putting them, all together. And one, of course, was, which for me, it's a very important study, which I've been doing in an important area on which very little work is being done. And that is this issue of public transport and roads and what's been happening to women in terms of travel, etc., etc. But remember, it's a long process of even privatization of roads. All right, don't forget that privatization of public transport. Now privatization of railways, certain lines have already been sold. So in a way, this links up very well with the point which Devnathan brought out. And that is the whole policy, which I had tried to talk, but obviously I could not go into any kind of a detail. And that is the nature of oligopoly, the sale of everything. You have your corporate loans, which are forgiven, but your poor SHG women who have loans of maybe 5,000, 10,000, which they can't pay, that is not forgiven. And this entire issue, I think it's a very clear policy, which is there of centralization of capital in a very, very small hand, and nothing exemplifies this much more than the information again which was given internationally by Fortune and Forbes and other magazines. We didn't get it here. And that is the further increase in the wealth of the richest in India. We already had 1% owning equal to 70%. And since April, and I'm going to take, we know the names of Ambani and Adani. Ambani was the 9th richest man in March 2020. And in August 2020, within a matter of 3 to 4 months, his wealth has increased by 36% to become the 4th richest in the entire world. Okay, so this is the kind of control and concentration, which of course, with the farm laws and various other kinds of events, your airports and ports and telecom, solar, everything which is being divided and linked. So therefore, you know, when okay, there were 2 or 3 other issues. One was the issue of feminism, I think, which has been raised, that how do different feminist perspectives, etc. I think it's like all different perspectives. I mean, let's not talk about divisions within the feminist movement. There's so many divisions within, say, the liberal movement, but there is unity, certainly, that on these issues you come together, whatever your differences may be. And that is one thing which I see as a huge hope, and which was shown during the anti-CAA struggles just before the pandemic came, and which is shown now, that all organizations, all NGOs, in the majority, of course there are few exceptions, etc., have come together. And whether it's women or it's farmers or it's workers or migrants or domestic workers, whichever category you talk about, I think that's one huge lesson which we have learned during that movement and during the anti-CAA movement. And now when we are facing this kind of, in fact, this is something which Nagmani has also raised a question in the question and answer thing, that the issue of us needing to come together. And that is something which is priority, whether it's a question of human dignity, that's an issue which was raised, or humanity, or whatever we may see it. And that we realize very clearly that the struggle of the people and the struggle of the people who've been affected of whatever categories is not to be mixed up with what is electoral politics today. I think those things are two very, very different issues, and that has to be in a way partly kept separate, but also to be interlinked in many different kinds of ways. And this, I think the NGOs, you know, they filled the gap. The state did not do anything where migrants were concerned. No transport, nothing, no food, nothing for a very long period of time. And NGOs, individuals, housing societies, I mean, just film stars, just everybody got together to support the migrants. And yet the greatest controls are on NGOs, are on organizations, whether it's in terms not only of, you know, filing cases or arresting, even things like FCRA rules and whatever other rules they may be. So these forms of control, which certainly exist, but the forms of resistance also, as Govind has pointed out, have increased very sharply. So the unpaid issue, which is very, very essential, and I certainly do not want to reduce, and that is something which, you know, I've written those 2-3 books on, that unpaid work or the resolution of unpaid work is not, it's not to be based on behavioral issues or behavioral economics. That if the, you know, husband is more sensitive and he does more of the cooking and he helps with clothes washing or childcare or whatever, then he is going to become, you know, then the problem of distribution of housework, of unpaid labor will be resolved. The resolution comes from the top. The resolution comes from creches being provided so that the family, including especially the women, of course, from clean cooking energy, from water directly within the house. These are the kinds of these are the macroeconomic base. So the redistribution of unpaid work is only from a national level, from a macro level. And that's why I call it the macro patriarchal state, that it does not take these issues into account. There are many other aspects. I will not go into it, but I would certainly like to end with, I think there are 2 minutes more, One is, I had prepared a long list, but it's going to take me, I think, several weeks to sit and calculate if the data is available. How much money is there available for distribution to the poor, even if you give universal basic income of 7,000 per, even if you want to say non-income tax paying family, forget about your Aadhaar or whatever it is, what it means for them and the amount of money which is available. I mean, every day you come into examples of wasteful expenditure. Of course, reduction in expenditure, there's a lot of money lying. You have your PM care, which there's no audit. You know, it's allowed to have no audit or transparency. You have, as of now, 20,000, but later on going up to another 40,000, a total of 62, 63,000 being spent on rebuilding the Parliament House. All right, the case, in fact, I filed a case along with few others in the Supreme Court in February. We don't have a hearing. We are not given time for a hearing, and already the date of the foundation laying of the new Parliament House and Gandhi statue being shifted is already being done. There is, of course, your bullet train contract on 26th of November. L&T got a contract of 25,000 crores to build a bullet train when trains are not running, and they're not going to be running for a very long period of time. So these, and I'm not even going to talk about Kartik Purnima, where how many? 11 lakh diyas were lit just 4 days ago. 20 quintals of roses from Kashmir. I mean, the cruelty of it and the insensitivity of it is something which shocks me. And when we talk about, the state, how do we perceive the state? It doesn't care. Is it blind, etc.? It was explained to me in one sentence by a migrant worker when I was working with them. And in Bombay, the plane was landing. And this was in April sometime. And one worker looks up and says, "Dekho, NRI वापस आ रहे हैं." All right. And the woman migrant next to me, she says, "हम भी तो NRI हैं." And I'm like, "क्या बोला? What? आप NRI का मतलब क्या समझते हो?" कहती है, "Non-required Indians." And I think that really defines, the nature of the state, that it doesn't care. It doesn't require the people at all. So I think to expect anything from this state, it's not blind, it's not sleeping, it's not that it doesn't care. I think people don't exist. They just don't exist. So therefore, no data. They don't care if there's no data on migrants. What does it matter? There's no data on, many issues which are being, and what is there is not released. I mean, a lot of the data, PLFS and other data, is leaked data in quotes. Please remember, it's not officially released data. Thank you.
Thank you.
In case I missed out anything.
Thank you, Professor Dewan, for responding with such pertinent points. We have one or two more questions and comments, if we can take those. So we have Sunidhi Agarwal. She is a researcher at IMPRI and she is joining us from Jamshedpur. Sunidhi.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, everyone. So as Anshula said that I am Sunidhi and I'm currently a student researcher at IMPRI and I'm joining from Jamshedpur, Jharkhand. First of all, ma'am, I would like to say it was such an amazing presentation and the points put forth by you were really so much. So like, ma'am, you have touched upon so many points about the Legislation Act since independence. And I would also like to say that there has been a lot of stance upon planning currently. But despite that, there has been disparity among women, be it rich, be it poor, and especially regional inequalities. So ma'am, what can the policies be in the backward states like Jharkhand, from where I belong, among the ones already doing good, and especially what can India learn from other nations? And from other developing countries, what are the best practices or any distinctive points that can lead to a positive impact in the lives of women and mainstreaming their roles with respect to the current situation like the pandemic?
Yes, let me also add a few things. Ma'am, what also we should not do? Because Sunidhi really asked what are the best practices. I would say what are the worst practices that we should avoid, especially in this time of pandemic. And ma'am has really started her lecture as an economist, taken from growth stance, and ma'am really used many new words: macro patriarchal state, not required Indian, and so many things. But some of the policy thing I also wanted to touch upon. In regard to SHGs, ma'am really touched upon, we have 6 million up to 10, so more than 6 crore of women. Something was launched in between, but that was also, I would say, just wishy-washy, that you make only around 1,000 SHGs participated in government e-marketplace and those sorts. Also in MSME, Mudra, in Narega, women have more, but in MSME, we have Stand Up India scheme also, but they are also very, very less of that. Ma'am really touched something upon housing, homelessness, and right to property. Govind ma'am did not touch upon that. So I thought really to highlight very pertinent issue from especially Mumbai. So many of experiences we are getting. And I really wanted to know from ma'am, since so many policies and other things ma'am has highlighted. Ma'am, you also mentioned about CAG and also then data. So when the CAG report is coming, and that is coming quite periodically, more than the data we are publishing, and it is highlighting even the parliamentary standing committee, they are highlighting so much of fudging and other things. Still, nothing is being done. Something we have gender budgeting in many states. There also nothing is coming out. What is the silver lining, or what do you see going ahead, the way should be, especially pertaining to policy or taking measures perhaps in this coming budget, or perhaps in the thinking of the whole planning processes? Ma'am really also touched upon one thing, that the ease of doing business, and then also touching upon ease of living index, many indices based on that. India now really fares so badly, especially our North India, in IMR and MMR, two of the very fundamental thing when we talk of gender thing. In fact, this region is getting behind Africa, Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. Ma'am, what do you see, how to change this? Because really the mindset, when we also go to state governments, the data on IMR, MMR, which they are collecting, they are having a very close watch. I think there also some positive things can come up. And the whole thing of reform, not only just limiting to India, but also worldwide, that a lot of push is given, especially now in this economic recession induced by the pandemic, on reforms. I would also say that in France also, the leader Macron, he has come, and he has also highlighted and very much raising the points for labor reforms and others, saying that it will spur the economic growth. And ma'am has really highlighted many of the labor laws. One of them was also bonus. I am really thankful to Professor Diwan for highlighting these issues. When we talk about gender, mostly maternity, and it's over. When we talk about work and women, so ma'am really touched upon those issues and how those levers can also be used. And yes, ma'am, touching upon all these issues and your concluding remarks, then I think Professor Kelkar can also add for the concluding remarks, or ma'am, whatever issue if you'd like to touch upon. Yes. Thank you.
No, nothing much more to say, because I think the questions which have been asked on best practices and worst practices will take till maybe 10:30 at night. So no time, we've already run over time. But one thing I certainly would say is, one, to keep people at the center of every policy. There's no two ways to that. And if there's one immediate best practice which we need to learn from, I think, almost every country in the world, is to give some basic income cash transfer every single month. And our godowns, which are bursting, where the cereal, the rice and the wheat are rotting, and which are going to be filled now. Don't forget, the season is going to come right now. They're going to be refilled. Is to distribute that as much as possible. Your fundamental, I mean, we are a republic still. All right. And all I can say is, let us claim the public provisioning of the republic, and let us claim that we are the center of the republic. These are, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Govind, ma'am, over to you. Yes, concluding. Yes, we are very much out of our time limit.
Nothing much to conclude, except to say that 2 points. One is that I think the best practice, Arjun, is the people's resistance movement. Okay, if any claims is made against
Hello,
them,
Arjun.
that would be the best practice. Utpal, they want to say
Arjun.
something.
No, ma'am, we should close. Yes, ma'am,
Okay.
we can conclude.
And second is really that if the kind of farmers question, women have to have the kind of land given to them, land rights. They need to have the land rights. Some justice needs to be done. And people have become aware about the one is that, which also I call it part of the best practice. The the falsehood or the kind of falsy nature of the state, that it gives wrong data, it's kind of it gives wrong promises to the people. A state is exposed so much that I think that, and people don't trust, farmers don't trust, women don't trust, Dalits don't trust. So the whole kind of, it is a trust deficit in the state, and that is the worst practice. Worst. Okay. And the best is people's kind of people's movement against it, whether it is where women are leading, and women farmers are leading, and the Dalits are leading. I mean, they are kind of thing, we are fighting back, and that is a very good kind of analysis, that we are talking about this kind of thing. And if a state could help, I don't expect much from the state that it would reform itself. It is only the people's movement that would, people's movement and the marginalized groups movement, among them women, because they are the majority of the marginalized, that would really, that is going in the right direction. With all our economic crisis, health crisis, this is the only way that I see some hope for ourselves, for India. Thank you. And it was a great kind of discussion and great lecture. And I've known Ritu for a number of years, and I've heard her. Dave has not heard her, but I have heard her so often. So that is, and she was at her best. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I think we can now quickly wrap up the session, and I should just propose a vote of thanks to so much to Professor Ritu Dewan for presenting her views, so many views, and touching upon so many of issues of what the pandemic has induced, and what the policy and the inherent patriarchy has been, and how this process is leading to gender de-equalization even in this time of pandemic, and how we should go ahead and mainstream women as for the economic recovery during this pandemic. I would also like to thank all of our other participants, our chair, Professor Govind Kelkar, Dr. B. Rajeshwari, Ms. Pankhuri Dutt, also Professor Devanathan, also to coming and sharing his voice. And from all of us, thank you and have a nice evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.